Greetings and welcome back to the channel, World War II Books Where to Start. I'm your host, General George Kenny, here in Australia, sweating it out at Max HQ, while we plug away at enemy positions in New Guinea. Today I'm going to take a look at two different aspects of the air war in two different theaters. One here in the South Pacific that's grinding combat, and one in India and China that's all cargo and weather. And so without further ado, let's hit the books. Alright, first up, we've got Fire in the Sky by Eric Bergerud from the dreaded Y2K. That's 2000 to the young folks out there. And that's going to clock in at 676 pages main body. So when you sit down to tackle this tome, be aware it's no like snack, it's a 7-course meal. You're going to be here a while, so settle in and bring a good appetite. Dense, and I mean jungle kind of dense, with anecdotes, asides, deep explanations, exceptions, the norm, the abnormal, and the edge cases. He covers the South Pacific aerial struggle like a blanket, breaking the book up in sections to cover the terrain and climate, the massive areas of fighting, the conditions for living and surviving, the stark choice a pilot in trouble had to make between the sea and the jungle, with the ever-present enigma of the weather to contend with, just like any pilot in any theater of war. The weather was always the X factor. It could be just as important as the machine you flew or the enemy you encountered. From here, he takes us through the Japanese and American aircraft used in this theater, with all their strengths and weaknesses, what they could do, when they couldn't do, and what they were made to do in the circumstances. That's really dense and takes a long time to get through, but wow, is it fantastic. He then goes on to cover the training methods of both combatants, which is a great bit of depth that normally gets left out of aerial warfare narratives. And losses. He is into the attrition, kind of broke the IGN's back kind of theory of the war. So losses are an important quantifier to him. And just to give you a sampler here, he breaks down the United States Marine Corps pilot losses as 815 killed in stateside training, 794 KIA in theater, and I think that's just South Pacific, but it could be an entire war. 560 lost to operational causes, 319 missing in action, and another 25 pilot losses outside of combat zones. Quantifying Japanese losses is far more difficult, as the record keeping was not a priority. Many records did not survive the war, etc., etc., but what is available just for IGN fighter pilots up to roughly the summer of 44 shows 1,035 known killed in action, 138 killed in accidents, and 245 survivors. This is roughly a sample of about 25% of the pilots trained in fighters throughout the conflict, but it's not conclusive in that those qualified before 1936 are not included. Oddly, the Japanese Armed Forces did not have an MIA category. Either you returned or you didn't, and if you didn't, you were presumed to have died in battle, with naturally no thought given to the remote notion of a man being taken prisoner. There was no air search rescue services as such in the IGN. Some individual commanders did order searches for lost pilots, but it was rare. If you went down to the rink anywhere over the horizon from your carrier or from your land base, you were on your own. Full stop. The sheer waste of throwing away highly trained specialist forces like trash is staggering. And Bergerud points out that there's no comparable study for the losses of bomber units, and apparently little to nothing has been done to study the IJA losses at all. Pretty puzzling, that lack of want to know from researchers in Japan. Part 3 is dedicated to how fighter formations fought and the mechanics of organizing missions, when pilots decided to engage in a fight and why, how they did so, and when they chose not to engage. The total uncertainty of fighting another man at 300 miles an hour, even if you thought you had the better aircraft, you never knew if you had picked out the wrong guy to mess with that particular day. Also covered is the bomber war in the South Pacific, a decidedly different airfare than in Europe. Being that this is a topic-by-topic book, he's going to go backwards and forwards in time repeatedly. So Guadalcanal comes up I don't know how many times at different parts of the narrative, then back to Moresby or New Georgia, Rabaul, the Slot, around and around you go, which contributed to my fatigue reading this beast. I put it down for a good long while before being ready to charge through the last 150 pages. And I'll just give you a couple anecdotes to entice you here. Over the canal one day, a Marine pilot at Corsair had to bail out when Zeros got the better of him, only to be shot at in his parachute in 2 passes by a Zero. The second time, the prop hit his foot, cutting off part of it. Luckily, he had a morphine shot in his uniform and was picked up later, but he later lost a foot when he was treated. Bergerud also states that American pilots didn't have the chivalrous instincts that were claimed to be common in ETO and would happily shoot down Japanese pilots in their chutes. Something to chew on, I suppose. Then there's another story about a Thunderbolt coming back damaged from a mission at the canal, I think it was a location, leaking fuel as he came in. His gear failed and he skids down the runway, fuel leaking and then catching fire behind him. The pilot casually gets out when his plane comes to stop and saunters away, unaware that a big kaboom's about to light him up, until finally he hears people screaming at him to run away. And then there was a case of the valve shot down over an airfield one day, and upon inspection, one of the crew was found, but the other was missing. A bit of a mystery. Later found when the Liberator crew went to the aircraft to ready it for a mission. The missing man had been catapulted through the sides of their aircraft, all the way through. Zoinks and yikes. There's one memoir mentioned many times in here that I want to chase down, but it's super duper out of print, and I'm not fond of the price points I see for it. It's called Nanette by Edwards Park. Nanette being his personal P-39. It's made out to be a foundational memoir of the Pacific, but it's just not lasted in print like many others have. There are 2 photo sections that I think are actually kind of weak. A lot more was needed here to capture the epic nature of what the author was attempting, so that's a letdown. But in case you haven't guessed, it's a bonanza of awesomeness. Highly recommended, 5 stars. That's Fire in the Sky by Eric Bergerud. Okay, next up is Skies of Thunder by Caroline Alexander from 2024, 380 pages main body. Right here, pretty cool cover. I had read another book by her called the HMS Bounty many years ago, and I've forgotten all about it until I looked her up for this one. I really like that one, and here she doesn't disappoint either, finding some lightly trodden territory in World War II writing that needs fleshing out. The airlift over the hump to supply China and keep a good old Chiang Kai-shek in the war, regardless of the actual effect these supply runs had on the course of the war. She's going to set the stage rather well with a short colonial history of Burma that's excellent, and then shift the China situation with Shek coming to power, the construction of the old Burma Road, and its tales of horror and cheap human life thrown away to build it. This is really medieval stuff, and the tales of kids being trampled by runaway grading equipment on the downhills is grisly. Once we get to the Japanese invasion of Burma and its eventual cutting of the Burma Road, of course, it gets worse with the mass evacuation of refugees trying to escape to India. She's not as graphic as a couple other accounts I've read of it, but she doesn't paint it as like unicorns and rainbows either. There's some nasty stuff in there. It just seems a bit dialed down from the catastrophe it really was. And then we enter Stillwell and Claire Chennault and their peculiar personalities and proclivities, their blind spots and their arrogance. Chennault really comes into focus in here for me. I've never really chased this guy down or anything about him, but he was a real oddball, having gone completely deaf from so many years in open cockpits. His army career at a dead end. He resigned, but he's brought back to life with the AVG idea, and perhaps not the ideal man to lead it with some of his kooky and simplistic notions of how to engage an enemy in the air, but somehow making it work, sort of. I had never heard of the bounty system the Flying Tigers had of cash rewards for shooting down Japanese planes, which devolved into a bit of a grift with RAF pilots sometimes selling their kills to Americans for half the proceeds. It's a dirty business, but that's how it was in CBI. And with no real military discipline or chain of command or accountability hanging over these guys to track what they're really up to, that kind of stuff's going to happen. This doesn't even get to Chennault's asinine plan he put the FDR to defeat Japan with precisely 135 fighters, 20 bombers, and a few other niceties he threw out as a deadlock war winner that was ridiculed by everyone in the administration until FDR shocked them with the notion that, by golly, it might have some merit. FDR was looking for anything that would speed up the end of the war and get on with what he thought was more important, saving China from the communists and ensuring a good trading partner with the Far East after the war finished. But what about the hump, you ask? Don't worry, there's plenty here for you too. Aside from the trusty C-47 we all know and love from the war and air shows, there's also the less well-known and the less loved C-46 Commando that had a tendency to catch fire mid-flight. The C-87 tanker conversion of B-24 Liberators that had serious deficiencies above and beyond what a normal Liberator had, and which took time to sort out so it could be semi-effective in the tanker role. And there's also the C-56, which had the odd feature of a gasoline-powered heater in the fuselage to heat the aircraft, blowing open flames into the cargo area. And that's got to be one of the worst ideas I've ever heard in aviation. Oddly enough, given the altitudes these aircraft operated at, over 20,000 feet, to get through the mountains, many crews didn't use oxygen, preferring to smoke cigarettes in order to stay focused and awake. There seems to have been new heated electric suits to plug into the board of the aircraft like bomber crews had in the ETO, and so it begs a lot of questions of how they got by like this. She has several anecdotes about crews getting goofy and sleepy from the lack of oxygen, and I just don't see how they managed it. Crashes and walking out. And it's incredible how many crews managed to bail out and walk away and walk out, although plenty were lost, obviously. One cargo plane smacks into a mountain head-on, more or less, hitting him perhaps at a bit of an angle to run up the mountain face before stopping. The crew made it out after many weeks with some indigenous tribes in truly inhospitable terrain. At their destination of Kunming, which is the whole point of flying into China, there was a crushed stone airstrip with hundreds of coolies living there to keep it functional, cracking stone nonstop to replace what was thrown out by the landing aircraft, living in squalid conditions hardly better than slaves. The massive amount of forced labor rounded up for the airfield construction and Burma Road building is simply astounding. Many of these coolies at Kunming would make runs across the runway in front of aircraft taking off, hoping to scare off their personal bad luck dragons. It normally ended bad for these folks, to the amusement of the other coolies who thought it was quite funny and frequently gambled on results. In China, human life just ain't worth that much. Not to be missed, there's also mention of a control tower at one of the airfields in India that was basically a treehouse. It was a platform built in the top of a tree. That's just really, really weird. I couldn't give you much confidence if you're a pilot, I would think. Also not to be missed is Mountbatten's little misadventure with pykrete at the Ottawa Conference, where he masterfully demonstrated the strength of the miracle substance of pykrete by firing bullets into it from a revolver. Alan Brick wasn't amused by this, I'm not sure why. But it's also extremely unclear why Mountbatten had the notion that the entire war effort would pivot from steel hulls for warships to this nonsense on the strength of a silly demonstration at a war strategy conference. It's not hard to understand why the combined chiefs wanted him out of the way. Then there's Chinese troops Shanghaiing any male they could find in the countryside to contribute to the 1944 and 45 offensives, trucking them to the airport and forcibly tossing them into the aircraft. While in flight, many times these terrified men and teens would simply open up the cargo hatch and jump out. Sometimes they tried to make fires to keep warm. Sometimes they pissed and crapped all over the aircraft's cargo area. And sometimes they jumped out as the plane ran down the runway, leading to crashes and near crashes. And then something strange happens. She diverts from the airlift over the hump to go full land campaign in Burma to reopen the Lido Road, which connected to the Burma Road, and then the battle/siege of Myitkyina. This involves Merrill's marauders and Stilwell hell-bent on showing up the Brits, whom he despised about as much as he hated Chang. Merrill has 2 heart attacks during this campaign and siege, adding to the one he had when walking out of Burma with Stilwell in 42. The man really had no business leading infantry troops in the field, and you think someone would have pointed that out and taken care of the situation, but hey, it's Burma, and we ain't got time for that shit around here. This full-on recital of the land campaign is quite a departure, and not what I thought I was getting from this history, but she makes it work. It was pretty cool. And then you can't forget Ord Wingate in all his looniness. He crops up a few times until he's killed in an aircraft crash, and he seems to have been far crazier than other accounts of him I've read. He just seems to have been really kooky. Alexander's account of him makes it quite clear the man was insane and ought to have been cashiered from the army. One must suspect that, as always in the British Army, as long as you came from a good family, just about anything you did would be excused and tolerated, providing that family was rich enough. Wingate was tolerated for far too long. An odd thing about his demise is that when Americans went to the site, they shipped home all the bodies of the dead, Wingate included, which wasn't the standard British way, and thus Ord Wingate is the only non-American buried at Arlington National Cemetery. I really haven't focused well on the pilots and their trials and travails. There's so much to relate from this book, but I'll have to leave that to you for discovery on your own. There are 2 books mentioned in here I want to chase down. The Road Past Mandalay, which I used to see all the time as a kid in paperback, but I never picked it up, and The Aluminum Trail by Chick Quinn. It's out of print, but I think it's worth getting. It's the tales of the pilots of the hump, and I think it'll be a good one. Skies of Thunder is certainly a good one. Hell, it's a great one, and a fantastic addition to the literature of war. 5 stars. Armchair Admiral approved. And with that, we leave the frigid skies above the Himalayas and the wrecks of hundreds of cargo aircraft strewn down there littering the jungles below. I certainly hope either one of these or both of them have caught your fancy, and I don't think you'll be disappointed in either one. I'm General George Kenning, soaking up the sun and beating the Japanese army all the way back to their home islands. I'll be here if you need me. Until next time, happy reading.